exhibition. I'm beginning with this point because I think it's important to keep in mind both this vast chasm that separates that historical period from this one, as well as the way in which that period, the period we often call the 60s, which extends, of course, into the 70s, the way in which that period continually intrudes upon our lives, often rematerializing in other forms, in many and varied forms. I could actually do an entire lecture on that. I could talk about the new Black Panther Party. I could talk about the ways in which this organization, this movement, individuals associated with that movement, including myself, and I actually saw the poster advertising this event, and that's an image from 1970, something like that. But I keep thinking about the ways in which the 60s are evoked within contemporary popular culture as a utopian moment, as an occasion for nostalgia, and not nostalgia in the sense that there are those of us who actually experienced it who are yearning for it, but this very deep nostalgia about that which appears to be lost today, that which appears to be unattainable. And this is a ubiquitous phenomenon which appears in video images, audio samplings, images on T-shirts, eBay. I mean, recently I spoke to a group of high school students at UC Santa Cruz, a group of high school students who were actually interested in applying to UC Santa Cruz. One of the organizers of the visit, the woman who had asked me to address them, came up and said, there's this young woman who's wearing a T-shirt from the 60s. And she told me it had my photograph, my image on it. And she said she must have inherited it from her mother or grandmother, right? I mean, I didn't tell her that undoubtedly it was a new T-shirt. That there are all kinds of similar commodities now that have caused me to think seriously about what it means. And I've actually had conversations because my first reaction is, oh no, not again, right? And then as I talk to young people who tell me why they are attracted to such images, and we're talking about images of Huey Newton and images of Fred Hampton and Assata Shakur, and we could go on. And I've heard a number of young people say they identify with those images because of the strength that they convey. Now, of course, these are basically headshots. So this is I appreciate the way in which that period and the images that circulate in today's economy from that period have come to stand for strength and power and revolution. But I question what it means to project the possibilities of strength and power onto the past. And of course, all of this is to say that we view exhibitions like the present one over at the museum with eyes that are not only disjoined from the culture that produced them. This is true of every engagement with images from the past. But I wonder how much it matters that our vision is tinged with commodified nostalgia. But to say a few words about the photographs, these are stunning photographs, powerful, beautiful photographs. And of course, the photographers are trained in the traditions of and worked with Ansel Adams and Dorothea Lange. So you see the whole history of photography in those photographs. You see the tension within the history of photography between documentation and art. Perkle Jones and Ruth Marion Baruch set out to document the Black Panther Party. But of course, as they document that movement, that organization, they create works that acquire separate lives as works of art. And in a sense, you might say this is why they're so haunting. And I would actually like us to think about that. I mean, it's not really an opposition between form and content, but it is about that tension between the aesthetics of the photograph and the moment, the historical subjects, the defiance, the rebellion they attempt to capture. When I say that the cultural lens through which we view such photographs today differs in major respects from the context of their production, I'm not suggesting that participants in that movement, or indeed former members of the party, have a more genuine relationship to the images. And I enjoyed reading Kathleen Cleaver's introduction to the new book, and perhaps she drew from that during her talk. When she looks at those photographs, she sees herself 37 years later as a young Black Panther Party member. And in the book, there are many photographs of Kathleen Cleaver. She's one of the sort of central figures in the documentation. But what she sees is time lost, the fleeting events, as she put it, given a timeless intimacy in these images. We were the ones, she writes, who fought, loved, and died for the right to live freely in our country. But it seems to me that these images are also as much about seeing through the camera, about seeing photographically, as Edward Weston put it. And images of the Black Panthers happen to be caught in the frame, as much about that as they are about the documentation of a movement that threatened to turn civil society upside down or inside out, however you'd like to put it. But let me try to pursue a different approach to the question of photography, history, documentation, nostalgia. But before I do this, and I sort of began to talk about this at the earlier event. I mean, you have to apologize me if I can't quite distinguish. I'm coming from a conversation, a wonderful conversation with Vilma Reyes from Brazil. So I would like to first pay tribute to the memory of Rosa Parks, who died last week. I grew up in Alabama and feel very connected to those events that, according to the conventional narratives, launched the civil rights movement. I would actually like to think in a more complicated way about the emergence of the civil rights movement. It's not that this woman who was a seamstress who just happened to be getting on a bus coming home from work and happened to be tired on a particular day. Her feet were hurting. You know, of course, she said, my feet were not hurting and I was not tired. Right. And she made a political decision to refuse to stand up. And that gets lost from the popular narrative. But that's not really what I wanted to talk about. As I was saying this afternoon, her body was welcomed, was it day before yesterday, into the Capitol Rotunda as the first woman and only one of 30 people who have been honored in death by a viewing in the Capitol Rotunda. She had, of course, the courage and determination of so many women of her generation. But the narrative of her contribution is that it was brought about through the serendipitous conjunction of her tired feet one day and the arrival in Montgomery of Dr. Martin Luther King. Of course, if I had time, I would talk at greater length about her formation as an activist, an organizer, her role in the local NAACP, her participation in the Highlander School, which was a rather radical school for the education of organizers. But for the moment, what I want to do is focus on a very widely circulated photograph of Rosa Parks in order to contrast it to the photographs upon which we are meditating this afternoon. I'm referring to that photograph, which comes from the UPI Bettman archives, of Rosa Parks sitting on a bus that appears to be empty except for one white man. Everybody's seen that photograph, right? She's sort of looking out of the window. Right behind her is one man, one white man. This, of course, was after the Supreme Court decision, but it's come to stand in for her act of civil disobedience when she refused to stand up, so a white person would have a seat. This image has become a quintessentially American image, reflecting in its peaceful ambiance and its individualist focus. Rosa Parks, the single black woman triumphant over the anonymous white male individual. This is the making of the new post-civil rights American nation. This is a photograph that invites identification, a photograph that transcends its own racial composition. This is a photograph of the woman whose body was allowed entrance into the Capitol Rotunda as a national hero. Now, I'm not suggesting that it would have been better had the Rotunda viewing not occurred. On the contrary, this event marks the significant difference between the era of her action and the present one. It tells us how far we have indeed come over the last half century. And of course, I remember being forced to go to the back of the bus. I mean, I could actually, talk about what it was like as a child growing up with all of the paraphernalia of segregation. But aside from criticizing the way in which this image has come to stand in for the triumph of American democracy, right? It makes me wonder also about the dead who have not been honored. It makes me wonder about the thousands of Iraqi people who have lost their lives and the Bush administration's seemingly unstoppable global war. It makes me think about the US soldiers whose deaths are treated as necessary sacrifice in this so-called war on terror. So much so that the 2000th person to be killed was not even acknowledged officially by the administration. Basically, they said, every death is like the other. Every death is equally tragic. I think that was the word the White House spokesman used. But I bring the Rosa Parks photograph into our conversation because I would like us to think about why the Black Panther photographs, 38 years later, still appear as marginal, exotic, utterly incapable of being incorporated into a historical narrative. Into a historical narrative that explains where we are today. And of course, that's the role of the stories that have been spun about Rosa Parks, to teach us where we are today. The Rosa Parks photo tells the story of discrimination, but discrimination overcome, of wrongs, but of wrongs righted, of democracy triumphant. But the Black Panther photos are about rebels, the lumpen proletariats, the militants. They aren't peaceful. They aren't nonviolent. There are some photographs which I suppose not even, it wasn't possible for them to be shown on this campus of members of the Black Panther Party with weapons. But I'll talk a little bit about the militarism. we want to try to establish a critical position toward that. But I noticed that there were photographs that didn't make it into the show. Well, a lot of photographs didn't make it into the show. But I can understand why. I can understand why. It would be very difficult for you to see those photographs and have any significant engagement with them,